On June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy, a 1/8 African-American man, was sent by the American Citizens Equal Rights Association to board the East Louisiana Railway first-class train car. Plessy was arrested for violating the Louisiana Separate Car Act, and the association brought suit because they believed that this act went against the 13th and 14th Amendments. Although there had always been conflict between African Americans and whites in the South, the actions of Homer Plessy increased this tension. Plessy's case was resolved in the United States Supreme Court with the compromise separate but equal, legalizing segregation in the United States. This phrase was overturned in 1954 when Brown versus the Board of Education declared separate but equal schools unconstitutional. Following the end of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln established a government program called Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, Northern troops began to rebuild the South and give African Americans equality. A series of civil rights acts were passed during this time period to support the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which gave all citizens equal rights. These new rights provided African Americans with equal access to public facilities and transportation. They protected African American citizens in the South and mandated that violators of the new Equal Rights Acts be punished. Many white Southern citizens found these laws unsatisfying because they still thought that they should have the right to decide on what African Americans could do. During this time, groups such as the Ku Klux Klan formed with the goal of obliterating these rights. In 1877, President Hayes removed Northern troops from the South, ending Reconstruction, because he thought that after 11 years, African Americans had enough sufficient support. In 1883, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the Civil Rights Acts of 1875, which prohibited discrimination in public facilities and transportation, as unconstitutional. Because of these two actions, public discrimination had been legalized, and life for African Americans and Creoles became increasingly difficult in the South. Southerners began to overtly discriminate against African Americans by, among other things, creating separate facilities for both races. This spurred groups of African Americans to oppose the institutionalized segregation. The American Citizens Equal Rights Association, or the ACERA, was founded in 1890 to oppose discriminatory actions throughout the South. There were many branches of this association, but the most accomplished branch was in Louisiana. This branch supported the Reconstruction-era rights given to African Americans. It was made up of 18 African Americans and African American Creoles, led by Aristide Mary, a leader during Reconstruction. The state of Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act in 1890 to take away transportation rights from African Americans by making them ride in a separate car than white citizens. Two members of this branch decided to put the constitutionality of the Louisiana Separate Car Act to a test because it went against the 13th and 14th Amendments. In 1891, Daniel Desdunes, an octoroon, or 1/8 African American, bought a first-class train ticket from New Orleans to Mobile, Alabama, and then seated himself in the white car after informing the conductor that he was an African American Creole. He was arrested on the train for not sitting in the Jim Crow car. Desdunes' case didn't reach the Louisiana Supreme Court because Judge John Ferguson claimed that the law didn't apply to interstate travel, and all charges placed on him were thrown out. Despite the ACERA's failure, the association decided to test the act again the following year. In June of 1892, Homer Plessy purchased a train ticket on the East Louisiana Railway from New Orleans to Covington, Louisiana. He boarded the train on a white-only car without struggle because he was not noticeably anything but Caucasian. Before taking his seat, Plessy told the conductor that he was in fact African American. He was arrested on the spot for violating the Louisiana Separate Car Act when he wouldn't move to the Jim Crow car. After this, the ACERA immediately went to work on a stronger case for Plessy than they had for Desdunes. They appealed their case to the Criminal Court of New Orleans and were put in front of Judge John Ferguson. The ACERA argued that the Louisiana Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. They also stated that since interracial marriage was legal in Louisiana, African Americans should be able to ride in the same car as whites. However, despite their argument, the court still upheld the Separate Car Act. After the district court's decision, Plessy appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court and then the United States Supreme Court. In 1896, the Plessy v. Ferguson case finally reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Throughout the case, the court debated over the rights of African Americans in the South. The majority of the court said that the 13th Amendment didn't apply to the case because the Louisiana Separate Car Act did not imply slavery. They also decided that although the 14th Amendment allowed citizenship to all races, there still could be distinction made between them. These statements made it clear that there was a lack of interest from the North in enforcing the rights of African Americans in the South. The decision was almost unanimous, with one lone dissent from Justice Marshall Harlan. His dissent stated that no race is more entitled than another, and that the Constitution never states that one race has power over the others. He also argued that if people from other races, such as the Chinese, could ride in white cars, then African Americans should also be allowed to, because they had lived in the United States longer than those from other races like the Chinese. Ultimately, the Supreme Court case ended with a compromise in favor of the state of Louisiana, which resulted in the phrase separate but equal. After the Supreme Court decision, life for African Americans became increasingly difficult. Because of their failure, the American Citizens Equal Rights Association disbanded. New Jim Crow laws were created, such as banning African Americans from interracial marriage, going to school with white students, playing baseball with white Southerners, or having the right to own a restaurant. The new phrase, separate but equal, implied that all people would have equal facilities, but they would be divided according to their race. However, many facilities didn't offer equal accommodations to African American citizens. Over the next 50 years, African Americans were legally oppressed by whites in the South. The majority of public spaces were segregated, including public bathrooms, restaurants, train cars, and schools. It became difficult for African Americans to vote or take government positions because unequal access to a good education left many illiterate, and in some states, reading tests or poll taxes were required to vote. African American children weren't allowed to go to white schools anymore, so new schools were founded solely for African Americans. These schools were poorly funded and weren't provided with the same materials as white schools. In 1952, this inequality was brought before the United States Supreme Court in the case Brown versus the Board of Education, which argued that separate schools were unconstitutional. The case was successful, and the compromise separate but equal was effectively overruled. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson arose out of the conflict between African Americans and whites in the South. The ACERA challenged the Louisiana Separate Car Act in an attempt to legally prove that the segregation laws of the Jim Crow era were unconstitutional. This case was brought forth to the United States Supreme Court, but ruled into law the compromise separate but equal. This phrase spurred half a century of legalized segregation and was not overturned until the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education case. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision wrote into law the belief of many white Americans that the African American race was inferior, paving the way for civil rights cases in the future.